Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we are discussing the animated movie Up, and then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query.
Here come the spoilers. The movie starts with Carl and Ellie as children and shows them growing up together, dreaming of being explorers, and then getting married and settling down. They repeatedly save up for a trip to Paradise Falls, which is Ellie's dream, but always end up spending the money on more pressing needs, which is totally a mood.
Right.
Carl finally buys tickets for the trip, but Ellie falls ill and dies before they can go. This is the point at which I paused the movie and cried for 3 days before I could resume. Just kidding, sort of. The neighborhood around Carl is slowly replaced by skyscrapers. When he unintentionally injures a construction worker who's building one of the buildings, the court orders him to move to a retirement home. But he has worked his entire life as a balloon salesman, which sounds like a pretty cool job.
I know. Right?
And he comes up with a plan, and that is attach hundreds of helium balloons to his house and fly away to Paradise Falls to keep his promise to Ellie. And that gives us sort of that visual that this movie is very famous for. Russell is a wilderness explorer, which is kind of like a Boy Scout, trying to earn his final merit badge for assisting the elderly. And he becomes an accidental stowaway in the house, and a storm drives the house all the way to South America, where the house lands opposite Paradise Falls. The house is still on the balloons, and they're not like floating all the way up in the sky, but they're still floating a little bit. So Carl and Russell harness themselves to the house and kind of walk around with it floating, hoping to reach the falls before the balloons deflate. They meet a tall, colorful bird they named Kevin, and a dog named Doug, who wears a special collar that allows him to speak. The next day, they encounter a pack of aggressive dogs who also have special collars, led by a dog named Alpha. And they're taken to the dog's master, an elderly explorer named Charles Muntz, who Ellie and Carl idolized as children. He has spent his entire life searching for a giant bird that he promised to bring back years ago. And when Russell notes the bird's similarity to Kevin, Muntz becomes hostile, thinking that Carl and Russell want to capture the bird for themselves. Carl and Russell flee with Kevin and Doug, but Muntz finds them and captures Kevin, then sets fire to Carl's house, at which point I almost cried again. I was like, no, not the house. That's all he has left. Carl is forced to decide whether to save his house or Kevin, and he chooses his house, which upsets Russell, understandably. Carl finally parks the house at Paradise Falls. Carl goes outside only to see Russell flying away using some balloons and a leaf blower, because that's totally realistic. Like all the rest of the house, like all the rest of the movie.
That's how I would fly. I fly that way every day.
Definitely. To try to rescue. So Russell's on his way to try to rescue Kevin. Carl lightens the house enough for him and Doug to follow, so he's still kind of moving the house around. Muntz captures Russell. But Carl and Doug board, Muntz has a dirigible, so they get on board with him and free Kevin and Russell. Muntz pursues them, but ultimately they escape, and the bad guy gets caught on some balloon lines and falls to the ground far below. Carl and Russell reunite Kevin with her baby chicks and fly the dirigible back home, taking all of Muntz's dogs with them. And then Carl becomes a grandpa-like figure to Russell.
Yep. That about sums it up in a very long way.
It was. I tried really hard to make it shorter, but I kept going like, no, that's important. You need to know that.
I know, because the movie is so good.
Although I suspect I might be the last person in the United States who hasn't seen this movie.
Until now. All right, so I love this movie, and I know I did make you watch it, and I'm not sorry about it, even a little bit. I think it's gorgeous and heart-wrenching and just like impeccably done, as most of these movies are. But This one was just like so good. When all the balloons fly to the house in that first moment, it's like beyond gorgeous, and I wish it was real. And not to just talk about the dark moments, but they were just so real and beautiful at the same time. Like that, there's a vignette in the beginning with Carl and Ellie's life, and it's just like full of love and companionship, but it just shows like the really sad side to love. And the shadows are what kind of made it really beautiful. And as sad as it makes me, I just love that. And I hold that vignette like kind of very close to my heart. I even made my husband and I once get like Carl and Ellie cozy chairs that like each show our own personality. And so we could read by our like pellet stove and be all cozy. We're just super adorable. So, you know.
You are both pretty adorable.
I know. It's true. Anyway, and then Carl learning to open up his heart again to a surrogate grandson is lovely and real. I love that he's like literally carrying around his baggage with him in the form of the house. Like, it's very over the top, but I kind of loved it.
It's a neat visual representation of how,
it is.
you know, we do carry these things around with us. And, you know, I think also the sense of how we hold on to things, grief.
Yes,
so it's very...
Exactly.
I think what's really neat about it, too, is how the balloons add levity, both, like, literally and figuratively.
It's so good.
Gives it this very pretty, fun appearance, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. That's not what we're talking about, but yeah.
No, yeah. But also, like, I'm already kind of a cranky old man, so I kind of really relate to Carl. And his relationship with Russell is just, like, so very, very cute. Like, even when he disappoints Russell. But anyway, so I can go on and on about it. But mainly, I just loved the shadows underlying all the beauty. I think it gave it this really beautiful sadness. What do you think?
Okay, so you know how you are with scary movies. That, like, you have to be mentally prepared for them and have a plan for how you're going to watch it and not have nightmares. Well, that's me with sad movies.
Yeah, that's fair.
So for whatever reason, books don't have the same impact on me, but sad movies stay with me for like a really, really long time.
You're welcome.
So I knew this movie was sad, and I've never watched it because of that. And because you're mean and made me watch it anyway, I had to prepare and have a plan. And even so, like, I cried so hard when Ellie died.
Yeah.
I even knew it was coming, and I still cried so hard. And it was so sad, and their relationship was so sweet. But to be fair, I don't think I've ever seen a Disney or Pixar movie that didn't make me cry.
Yeah.
Like, let's not even talk about Moana.
Oh, God. Yeah, right?
But otherwise, I really agree with everything that you said. It's visually very beautiful, definitely tugs at the heartstrings, has that satisfying character growth in the end. And I kind of love that it's a kid's movie where the protagonist is an older adult. Like, I'm not sure that you could actually get away with that in a book. At least not until you've had a couple of successful novels published. But I love having older adults in kids fiction anyway, because I think there can be something very special about those relationships where there's, you know, a 60 or 70 year age gap between the characters. I think can be, really a really special and unique kind of relationship. And yeah, I am pretty sure that even as a kid, I would have identified more with Carl than Russell. And I definitely do as an adult.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think part of what Pixar does so well is that they balance that sadness and that dark shadow side with levity and humor and sweetness. And I think that's why the movies are appealing not only to kids who sort of only maybe get one note out of that, but to adults as well. That's why, you know, adults don't mind taking their kids to see Pixar movies as much as they do some others.
I agree.
Yeah, so what did this movie do well that writers can take into their writing?
Story structure.
Yeah.
We're finally coming to our structure episode.
Yay, only a year into it.
Only took us a year to get there. It's not like the basis of all writing or anything. Right. You know, that's fine. All right, so there are a lot of different types of structure, which is good news because there kind of gives you some options and you can find the one that works best for you. But at the same time, they're all very, very similar. So don't discount them. But they basically just shift things around a bit, and some can make them easier for you to grasp than others, and that just means it's the one you should work on and the one you should connect with. So the first one is the classic type of structure, and it's 3-act structure. It's the main one that you learn in your high school English class. And it basically breaks down like this. So we have Act 1 is the setup, where we learn about the main character's normal life. And we have the inciting incident that sets them on the road to solving a question. Then we have Act 2, which is the bulk of the novel. And it is the rising action, or like the confrontation, where the main character works to solve the question and learn enough in order to go against the antagonistic force. Through the second act, things get much worse before they get better, because your main character doesn't have all of the pieces yet. And then finally, you get Act 3, which includes the climax where everything comes to a head. The main character resolves the plot and is forever changed from the action that took place. And then you get 4-act structure, which is really just 3-act structure, but broken down a bit more. And I find it can give you a little bit of a clearer perspective. I would say it's my favorite version of it.
I think so too. I really kind of hate that 3-act structure is called 3-act structure, because it makes really you think it's like structure. Broken down into like 33%,
yeah,
across the board. But it really, I think 3-act structure makes a lot. I mean, 4-act structure, calling it 4-act structure makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. I agree. So basically, again, Act 1 is your setup, which includes the inciting incident, which leads us to the first plot point, which is a context shift where the main character is forced to switch into taking action, which then leads us into Act 2, which is the response. Here we have the main character responding to the antagonistic force, which leads us to the midpoint where everything changes and the main character learns new information. That leads us into Act 3, which is then the attack, where the main character faces the antagonistic force and finally begins to make some sort of headway, or they fail spectacularly, either way. This leads to the second plot point, the major moment that accelerates us to the end, where we get into, finally, Act 4, the resolution, where we see the fallout of all the actions and the resolution of the major conflict. It basically takes Act 2 in the 3-act structure and breaks it into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Right. And I think it does. I think for a lot of people, it's just easier to wrap your head around because the pieces are all equal sizes.
Yeah. We get 25% for each section instead of 25, 50, 25. There are a couple methods that kind of build on this 3 or 4-act structure that can kind of help you implement them into your own writing. So first we have something called the snowflake method, which basically starts really small and slowly builds on itself. So step 1 of the snowflake method is you start with one sentence that sums up the conflict of your story. X does Y to overcome Z, etc., things like that. It's basically your story pitch. And then in step 2, you stretch that into a paragraph that includes like the setup, the 3 major disasters, and then the ending. And you do 1 sentence for each thing. And then step 3, you write about a page about each main character and their personal arc and growth. And we talked about character arc in our last episode a bit more, but basically their internal struggles, what they face and how do they change. And as you continue on in this method, it goes through, I think, like 10 steps. Each step deepens the story arc and the character development until you're basically left with a very complete roadmap of your entire plot.
It has a neat visual element to it as well that I think is helpful for
really
people who are more visual thinkers.
It turns into a snowflake.
It does.
It's so cool.
So pretty.
It is.
It's perfect for wintertime.
And then another method that is very popular is the Save the Cat method, which was originally written for screenwriting, so it's very apt for our whole podcast. And it is also basically 4-act structure. So Act 1 is the setup, which includes like your opening image, stating the theme, the general setup, and then citing incident or catalyst. And then they have a debate where the main character waffles on the action that they're going to take. Then the next is Act 2A, or just 2, where we learn new information, and there are like the fun and games. The end of this act is the midpoint where everything changes again, which leads to Act 2B, or, 3, where the bad guys close in. There we have the all is lost moment. We have your main character's darkest moment. And then we break into Act 3, or, 4, which includes the finale and the final image where they execute a new plan and everything is resolved. Okay, so that was a lot of me talking, but it's kind of a very... Yeah, well, that's why you love me. It's fine. But that's basically a quick overview of the different types of structure and how, like, different methods of implementing that structure can sometimes help it really click into place.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was over here thinking about Ellie and crying.
Oh, okay. Should I just do the rest of this podcast alone? Are you okay?
You basically already have anyway, so yeah, I think that's a great idea.
You're welcome.
So I really encourage you listeners to really do a little bit of research about the different kinds of structure. I mean, really, like Carly said, it's basically all 3-act structure. 3-act structure is kind of the foundation of all of these. And then each kind of other type of structure is really just another way of looking at 3-act structure. Yep. So, we're always talking about, experimenting with things, seeing what works for you. So I really encourage everybody to check out all of these and anything else you can find in terms of structure and just kind of mess around with it and see what works for you. What I'm really excited about with talking about structure with this movie is that there's a lot of good information out there about Pixar's storytelling structure. They do use like a 3-act structure, and it's like Save the Cat in that it can be applied to novels as well as movies. Pixar has a very particular way of telling their stories, though. Mm-hmm. You know what a nerd I am for the writing process, and
as you should be.
Right, and when I found out about this Pixar story stuff several years ago, I was like all in. So I'm really excited to have a chance to kind of nerd out about it here. So this information came from, it's come to be called like Pixar's 22 Rules of Storytelling. But it really came from a series of tweets by Emma Cole, who was a storyboarder for Pixar at the time. And these are like some things that she learned. And so like on our website where we have the script for this podcast, I'm going to have all of the 22 rules listed there. I am not going to pull a Carly and just tell you all of these rules.
Rude.
But some of them are fantastic. I'm just going to go through the first 3. So number 1 is you admire a character for trying more than for their successes. Number 2, you got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun for you to do as a writer, because those can be very different. Number 3, trying for theme is important, but you won't see what the story is actually about until you're at the end of it, and then you have to rewrite. I think that one's super important. And then number 4 is kind of what we're talking about here. It gives us a breakdown of what Pixar's sort of storytelling structure looks like, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But so yeah, after you listen to the podcast, head over and look on our website and you can see all of the 22 rules there. I won't go into all of those. But they've also created this free storytelling class. Pixar worked with Khan Academy to create this storytelling class where you can really dig into like what Pixar has done, how they apply it to their stories, and you can learn to apply it to your own stories that way. So it's really like this, again, it's just this other way of approaching 3-act structure that I think can be very helpful for writers. And I think what makes this particular approach good is that we can see across like all of the Pixar movies kind of what we do on this podcast, you know, that you can use Pixar movies to break down like how they're structured. And it's cool to be able to see like across all of the different kinds of stories that they've told, how they use essentially the same structure, but it doesn't really come through as formulaic. Yeah. And like I said, it appeals to kids, it appeals to adults. So like they really know their audience. And in order to be able to appeal to both young children and their parents, you have to have this very entertaining level, but then this deeper, more emotional level as well. So I think there's honestly a lot more to talk about than we can actually talk about in this particular podcast. So yeah, all of those links are going to be on the website as well. So you can come and hit up the Story Chat Radio website to kind of do more research on Pixar storytelling, because we don't have time to get into it all right now.
I'm going to read my favorite one though.
Okay.
So coincidences to get characters into trouble are great. Coincidences to get them out of it is cheating.
Yep.
Because it's true.
It is true.
All right. So, as Jenny said, Pixar is a beautifully simple story structure that they call story spine. I'm not sure that they called it that, but it's what it is now called. Mm-hmm. So, like 3-act structure, no one really came up with this. It was observed from analyzing the history of their stories. But what's neat is that it can be summarized almost like a fairy tale, which is very Pixar and Disney. So it breaks down into: once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. And ever since that day, blank. I feel like blank is starting to not sound right to me anymore.
It's like not even a word anymore.
Is it a word? All right. So how that basically breaks down for Up is: once upon a time, there was an old man that missed his wife. Every day, he thought of their dreams to travel to Paradise Falls. One day, he was evicted from his home. Because of that, he attached balloons to his house and flew it to Paradise Falls with an unexpected stowaway. Because of that, he lands too far from Paradise Falls and must walk his house there with Russell's help and the help of Doug. Because of that, they find a bird named Kevin and are confronted by the antagonist, who captures Kevin and Russell. Until finally, Carl lets go of his past in order to save his friends. And ever since that day, he and Russell form a bond, and he steps in as a grandfatherly figure.
Right. So I think that's a really great breakdown. And as you can kind of see here, what it's really doing is it's pulling out plot points. So some of those plot points that are called different things, depending on which form of structure you're looking at, yep. You know, it's really just giving you a different framework for that, for looking at those same plot points.
I just realized we should have used this as our synopsis.
We definitely should have. This was like way shorter.
Yeah. Oops. All right. Continue.
But again, this is just another way of looking at that foundational 3-act structure. So for those familiar with 3-act structure, these kind of plot points break down like this. So in Act 1, where you introduce the character's story, understand where the story is going, we do the once upon a time, which is kind of where we meet the protagonist. Every day, which is showing the ordinary world, the setting of the story. And then Until One Day, which is your inciting incident. All of those are going to happen in Act 1. And then in Act 2, this is where we have the main character choose and act while overcoming obstacles toward a goal. So that's really conflict, and that's phrased as because of that in this. Yep. So we only listed 2 because of that in the initial sort of breakdown, and we found as we were going through that we really needed 3 because of that to be able to understand this plot. And then if you're using this for your own story, you might find that you need more than that as well.
Well, I like because of that too, because it it's more about like conflict and response, because of that has a
Right.
very strong response element. And you want to make sure that your characters are being active and responding to factors.
Right. And so it speaks to character agency.
Exactly.
It speaks to consequences of actions. Because another way that you might consider phrasing this would be like, and then. But truly, you don't want to have and then. You want to have
Exactly.
because of that. You want,
Exactly.
in order to have a plot versus sort of just a series of events that happens in chronological order, we really need to see that the actions that happen later in the story could only happen because of things that happened earlier in the story. And that's how you build
Exactly.
on a plot, as opposed to things just sort of happening and then your character reacting to them.
Yep.
So because of that, that phrasing is very important. And then in Act 3, we have the character meet their final challenge and resolve the story. So if, according to this story spine, that would be until finally, which is your climax, and then ever since that day, which is where you sort of wrap everything up and you're showing the characters return to their new normal world.
The denouement.
Yeah, denouement. So
I just like saying that word.
it's real fun to say in a southern accent.
Ooh, can you do that?
Denouement.
Oh, I know. I loved it. That was amazing.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. So to go back up and kind of look at what Carly was talking about, we would have Act 1 is once upon a time there was an old man that missed his wife. Every day he thought of their dreams to travel to Paradise Falls. One day he was evicted from his home. That's sort of his inciting incident. Because of that, we're moving into Act 2. He attaches balloons to his house and flew it to Paradise Falls with an unexpected stowaway. Because of that, he lands too far from Paradise Falls and must walk his house there with Russell's help and the help of Doug. And then because of that, they find a bird named Kevin and are confronted by the antagonist who captures Kevin and Russell. So we see all of the conflicts there, and we see that each of those builds on the previous one. It can only happen because the previous one happened. And then as we move into the final act, Act 3, we find until he finally lets go of his past to save his friends. And ever since that day, he and Russell form a bond, and he steps in as a grandfatherly figure. So you can kind of see how those different plot points for the Pixar story spine break down into a typical 3-act structure.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
a denouement.
I love it. And can the podcast just be you saying that over and over?
I think we should just change the name of the podcast to
denouement.
denouement.
I feel like this is some sort of ASMR. It's like so soothing to me to have you say this. I love it. All right. So you can use all this kind of structure stuff to plan a new story, or you can use it when you're editing to make sure your main character has agency and that your story is building on itself. So whether you're a pantser or a plotter, structure is important to know and to implement. So if you're a plotter, writing out the structure will help you create an outline and kind of keep your manuscript moving as you intend it to. But if you're a pantser or someone that just like lets the story come to them as they write, that's fine. It's still very important though. Your pacing is going to lag if you don't take structure into consideration. So your first round of editing in that case should be checking that your draft aligns itself really well with either 3 or 4-act structure. So as you look into these types of structure or like the different ways to implement them, you'll find all sorts of breakdowns that show you at like what percentage your book should be hitting each specific point. And this structure keeps your story moving and keeps your readers interested. You may find you've even done it unintentionally because this structure is so ingrained in the media that we all consume. So don't fear this tool as being like predictable or boring. It's really what makes a compelling story, and without it, readers often lose interest. So really use this tool. Don't just dismiss it.
Yeah. I think so. When I talk to sort of hardcore pantsers about story structure. Often, a couple of things might happen. Either their eyes sort of glaze over and they're like, no, story structure, that is like, my brain can't compute that. Or sometimes they get very defensive, like, I'm never going to use a story structure and I will die on this hill. So pantsers, I want to talk to you for a minute. First of all, if you've made it this far, you must really love us.
It's
and
true.
Like, aw, we love you too.
Thank you.
That's how I'm taking it anyway. Like, if you're still here, it's either that or you're like raging so much that you just haven't been able to turn the podcast off yet.
Yeah, that's fair
either
too.
of those is possible, but I'm taking it as love.
Maybe you should say denouement again for them.
Denouement.
Thank you.
So I know structure can feel restrictive when you're used to discovery writing, but like Carly said, you don't necessarily have to use it before you draft. However, almost all the authors I know who have published several books sort of end up as plantsers, which is like half plotter, half pantser. And it can be very helpful to have a general idea of where your story is going and then sort of pants how you get from one point to the next. So it still gives you that fun of surprising yourself and discovering your story and characters along the way. But it keeps the story from getting too off track, so you can hopefully end up with a first draft that has more usable content. So I think that, like Carly said, try to keep an open mind about it. And, even if you aren't able to use it as a drafting tool right away, you're definitely going to want to use it in revisions. And I want to point out again, and I know I've said this on previous podcasts as well, that 3-act structure isn't something that like somebody came up with and decided like we have to impose this on all stories. And instead it was something that was discovered through researching and analyzing, thousands of stories over the course of all of human history, really.
Yep.
So it's really a structure that was discovered, not something that you have to impose. And once you start studying it, you can really find that most of the stories that you love come very close to finding that on their own. And really, this is again about understanding what your readers expect, and making sure that you are intentionally breaking rules and, following the rules that are going to help them to feel secure in knowing what they're getting with your story.
Secure and satisfied.
Yes.
You want your readers to be happy. That's how you keep them happy. I agree. All right. So now it is time for our query critique. This query is about a book that is a young adult contemporary romance. So, Jenny, what are your thoughts on the query?
First of all, again, we have yet another story about a romance, about young people falling in love. This story sounds so cute.
It does.
Like, just the two main characters and how they come together sounds adorable. And I think the author does a pretty good job of explaining the overall plot, which can be so hard to do. Just that part of it, condensing your story into less than a page, is really hard.
Yeah.
But it's hard to feel much connection with the characters. Dual point of view can be hard to work into a query because you've got so few words and you need the agent to connect with the characters and the story. And it's just harder to focus on both characters. But it's really important to make sure you've got the internal arcs and emotional wounds in there. It's really common to focus only on one character if it's a non-romance dual POV. But for a romance, I think it's good to get both in there. My recommendation is to rework this format so you can focus more on the internal arcs and get the agent to connect better with the characters. And I think, Carly, you had some further thoughts on that.
I do. So it is actually pretty apt that it's not, Up isn't necessarily a romance, but we did talk about structure, and this one needs a little bit more structure. So my advice for writing a query for a romance is kind of specific. I tend to like a very specific format because it helps to flesh out both main characters. So you have your paragraph of, we call it like metadata, like the title, the word count, any kind of comps. And you also have your hook, just like with most queries. And then the second paragraph is all about your first main character and their internal struggles and the conflicts they must face and their emotional wounds, like Jenny said. Then the second paragraph is all about your second main character and their internal struggles and conflicts. And then your third paragraph brings them together and discusses the conflicts they must face together and their stakes. So you'll have those 3 body paragraphs that kind of really get into both character and their combined journey, which is really what your plot is. And then finally you have your biography paragraph. Now this author doesn't have a bio in their query, and they did mention to us that it was a concern for them as they don't have any writing credentials. So instead, what Jenny and I often recommend in this paragraph is give us a little bit of your personality. Mention any experiences that helped you to write this story, or give some background that could help you forge a connection with the potential agent. Sometimes, like a shared interest in knitting or a shared hometown can help the agent look on you a little bit more favorably. And it just kind of shows who you are and what kind of person you are and what you would be like to work with. It can just forge a bit of a connection. And you have the space, so you might as well utilize it to the best of your ability.
Yeah, I think it's just important when you don't have credentials and you're writing a bio, it's important to keep it very short.
Yes, do keep it short.
So your word choice matters a lot. In showing that personality. And, you want to show some personality, but you don't want to go over the top. Like you're trying too hard to be funny or,
right.
Too cutesy or quirky or anything like that. But yeah, I think what Carly just said, is spot on. So it's just about, getting a little bit of that personal information in there, but keeping it short.
Agreed. All right. So we've come to the end. Are you...
Or the denouement.
Yes, thank you. How mad are you on a scale of 1 to 10 that I made you watch Up?
Like 100.
Oh wow, it's more than I was expecting.
I mean, I can't really be mad since I made you watch a scary movie.
Two scary movies.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, 2.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think Get Out was really that scary.
It was scary and A Quiet Place.
Well, I'm not going to keep arguing about it. Mm-hmm. I think this makes us even.
I don't know about even. I feel like I get 1 more, or like half a 1 at least.
Maybe.
I was expecting you to say 11 on a 1 to 10, not 100. So we're already worse off than I expected.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, such a good note to end on. On our next podcast, we will be discussing the classic comedy mystery Clue. We will also have another query or blurb critique. If you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter @StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.